Hey guys, Holly Priestley here with 8Z Real Estate here in Denver, Colorado. This will be the third in my little mini series about my personal experience buying a house when I was 24 and the surprises that I encountered at that time before I had bought a house before I was a realtor. And I'm hoping that by sharing my experiences, maybe I can make your first time home buying process a little bit easier and answer some of those questions that you have. So the first surprise that I encountered was Earnest Money, and I talked about that in a previous video. And one of the next large surprises that I experienced was closing costs. So I know that we're kind of bookending the process here with Earnest Money is something that you pay right at the very beginning, and closing costs come at the very end. But I feel like those were two of the biggest surprises for me and probably for most people. And because they have to do with so much money, might as well just talk about them right away and get that out, get those questions answered. Um, One of the reasons that closing costs was a big surprise to me was just the amount of them and how many different things go into the closing costs. And, why do I have to bring all this money to closing? Isn't that what my loan is for? Like, oh, it kind of goes towards your down payment. Okay, whatever. So typically, closing costs are between 2 and 7% of the sales price, which I know is a big range, but it really just depends on how your contract is written, what your state requires, what title requires, what your lender requires, and those sorts of things. So some of the fees and charges that are incurred during the process are paid at the time of service. For instance, a home inspection, typically the inspector is paid when he does the inspection on the house. But an appraisal, for instance, is not paid until the very end. So the appraisal cost is rolled into closing costs. If for some reason your inspector is not paid at the time of inspection, that's in your closing costs. Your loan origination fee, title search, title transfer, and other fees like that kind of go into the final price. And in some contracts, the buyer and the seller split the closing costs 50-50. Sometimes the buyer takes all, sometimes the seller takes all. It really just kind of depends on how that's written and which fees are attributed to which person. So the appraisal, for instance, that is a fee that the buyer incurs because the buyer needs the appraisal for the lender. So when you take your closing costs and down payment to closing with you, you cannot just take a personal check or a duffel bag full of money. You have to get a cashier's check. And for me, that was kind of tricky. I had recently moved to the town that I was living in, and I had a credit union in Denver. I was living in Fort Collins, buying a house in Fort Collins, and getting a cashier's check ended up being really tricky for me. The credit union that I had been using previously to conduct my banking business, like a week prior to my closing, had decided that they weren't going to do cashier's checks anymore for anybody who wasn't from their credit union. So most credit unions kind of share customers. Like if you use a big bank like US Bank, they've got branches all over the place and you can go to any of them. Credit unions are typically smaller. They might only have one branch. In the case of my credit union at the time, it only had one branch in Lakewood, and I was not able to drive an hour one way to pick up a cashier's check. So I was trying to get them the day before closing, and I found out that the credit union I was using wasn't going to do cashier's checks anymore. So I went to another credit union and was transferring over some money from savings into checking, and then they weren't doing cashier's checks for anybody that wasn't their customer either. And it's like approaching 5 o'clock, 5:30 when banks close, and I needed to have this like right now. And I was starting to panic, and this is all of my money here, and I need to have this cashier's check or I'm not going to be able to close. So it was like the third or fourth credit union I went to where I finally was able to get my cashier's check. So that's a thing. Make sure that you have plenty of time to get to the bank to get your cashier's check before closing. And when your lender and your realtor send out those documents that line out all of the fees, read them. If you have any questions, ask lenders or realtors. We should be able to answer those questions for you. So that was definitely a surprise for me, and I hope that this video has kind of helped clear that up for you. If you have any questions about closing costs or anything else real estate related, just let me know. And I hope you guys are having an awesome week. Again, this is Holly Priestley with 8Z Real Estate, your house matchmaker.